Hi, I'm Jay Phelan. Let's learn some biology. We've been talking a lot about the nervous system from a abstract theoretical sense. We're going to talk today about a practical aspect of it. I want to talk about alcohol. When you order a drink, if you order an alcoholic beverage, you get some ethanol. This is a small molecule. It's got 2 carbons, 1 oxygen, 6 hydrogens. It's usually produced by yeast that are consuming sugar as their energy source. There are about 200 quintillion molecules per half ounce of ethanol, something that you would have in an alcoholic beverage. It doesn't matter which alcoholic beverage that you're drinking. It can be wine or champagne or beer or tequila or gin or Baileys or vodka or rum or scotch or whiskey. It's always the exact same molecule that's responsible for the alcohol's effect on you. So why is it that alcohol has an effect on us, or has actually multiple effects on us? Well, after you consume the alcohol, some of it's going to be broken down in your stomach, and then a lot of it's going to be absorbed in your small intestine, the first part of your small intestine. From there, it's going to get into your bloodstream, and it'll go to your liver. And in your liver, about 17 different forms of an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase is going to get to work on it, breaking it down into various products that can either be used or excreted. But some of it slips by, gets into the bloodstream, and then it moves around all around your body, and it gets towards your brain. In your brain, because it's a small molecule, it can cross the blood-brain barrier and get into where all of your neurons are. So once it's in the brain, the ethanol is going to induce a lot of different changes in the brain because it mimics a whole variety of neurotransmitters and alters what happens in these various synapses. Remember, we looked at caffeine, and caffeine got to the brain and it blocked the adenosine receptor sites, and that was it. It was like a surgical strike. You could consume caffeine and go about your daily business and everything is fine. Alcohol, on the other hand, has lots of different effects. So it's completely broad, particularly relative to something like caffeine. So let's look at some of the effects. I'm just going to show you a few of them, 5 of them, and you'll get a sense that it is really doing a lot of different things to you. The first is that alcohol sedates us and it reduces anxiety a little bit. It does this because it increases this neurotransmitter called GABA. It stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid. That's not so important. But GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. In other words, when it is docking on cells, it causes them to be less likely to fire. So it slows you down. Well, alcohol causes more GABA to be released. And it also increases the sensitivity of the GABA receptors, so they are more effective. So what's going to happen? You are essentially increasing the amount of this inhibitory neurotransmitter, and so it's going to have a sedative effect on you. There are some drugs, you've certainly heard of Valium, used to treat anxiety and muscle spasms, Xanax, used to treat anxiety and panic disorders. Guess which neurotransmitter system is going to be affected by Valium and Xanax? Exactly, GABA. But because it's inhibitory, GABA also has effects like causing your speech to be slurred. It also slows down your reaction times, from the time you perceive something to the time when you can process that information and take action on it. That's why you're going to be much less efficient and effective at driving, operating heavy machinery, just doing things that require quick response. Now, second effect that alcohol has is that it causes people to have feelings of euphoria. This is because it causes dopamine to increase in the brain. We know dopamine, the chief happiness neurotransmitter in the brain. So what's going to be the result of that? You got it. It's going to make people experience some pleasure and even euphoria. Third type of effect that alcohol has is that it can block pain. It does this by stimulating endorphin release. Endorphins are these chemicals in our body that block pain messages. These are also responsible, for instance, for runner's high. So your body should be experiencing some pain. They're released so that now the pain signal can go down so that you can process other information. They also reduce anxiety. Morphine and heroin mimic endorphins in much greater amounts. Alcohol stimulates endorphin release. So what do you think is going to be the effect of that? Well, if endorphin release is responsible for runner's high, you're also going to have those sorts of feelings when you are consuming alcohol. There's a journal, scientific journal, that's actually called Pain, where they do research on pain. And in one study called Feeling No Pain, Alcohol as an Analgesic, they took a bunch of volunteers and they actually gave them alcohol, and then they looked at their sensitivity to pain. And they found that 2 cocktails produced tolerance to experimentally induced pain comparable to a dose of morphine. A fourth effect that alcohol has is that it causes your contentment to also be increased. Dopamine is more like euphoria. Serotonin is more of this feeling of contentment, satiation. What alcohol does is it increases the serotonin receptor activity. In a big compendium of research on alcohol, what researchers have found is that when people are asked about their experiences while drinking, by far the most common response people give is they feel happy and cheerful. Alcohol makes them feel happier. Interestingly, some researchers used artificial selection in the lab, and they bred rats so that they had populations of these rats that had a higher preference for alcohol. Typically, they don't really have much of a preference for it. It turns out that this selection causes these rats to have lower serotonin levels than the typical rats would have. The consuming of alcohol kind of bumps up the serotonin again. We think that's what is responsible for them having this greater preference for alcohol. A fifth of the effects of alcohol is that it slows you down a bit. It does this by blocking the glutamate receptor. Glutamate is probably the brain's major excitatory neurotransmitter. This is something that is active in learning, in memory, in just brain functioning. By blocking the glutamate receptor, what's going on? It can't do its excitatory stuff that it's going to do. It's going to slow you down. And it's going to slow you down in a way that there are physical decrements and cognitive decreases in your functioning. In a study that looked at college students even, they found that alcohol dampened the activity of the glutamate receptor, as we know, and it impaired learning and memory. If you give alcohol to animals, their learning as well is impaired. So we've got all these different ways, and these are only some of them. There are other effects, we don't even know all of them. Alcohol's got these multiple physiological effects because it is influencing lots of different neurotransmitter systems in your brain. So, all right, so you consume some alcohol, then how does our body process it? What's going on? It doesn't stay in our system forever. What's going on after you consume a drink? Well, you take ethanol, you get into your system. The first thing that happens is that you've got this enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase. And alcohol dehydrogenase does just what the name says, dehydrogenate. It rips off a hydrogen from ethanol as the first part of a metabolic pathway, the breakdown of ethanol. So when you rip off the hydrogen, now you're left with something called acetaldehyde. Then your body has another enzyme, something called aldehyde dehydrogenase. Does the same thing, rips off another hydrogen. The acetaldehyde then is modified into acetate. Acetate is something in your body that is relatively easily metabolized. It gets converted into energy, CO2, water, some fatty acids as well, and the breakdown is done. You might wonder, well, why do we even have these enzymes for breaking down ethanol? The distillation of spirits and the production of these as something that we consume, that's relatively new. Remember, in our colon, we have huge colonies of symbiotic bacteria that are helping us out. Well, these intestinal bacteria, they produce ethanol as a byproduct of their normal metabolism. They don't produce that much, but this is responsible for us having evolved over time the ability to produce these enzymes that first break down ethanol into acetaldehyde and then acetaldehyde into acetate. But this is why we get drunk on just a few drinks, because we completely overwhelm that system of the production of those two enzymes. Here's something you might be familiar with, either firsthand or secondhand. Some people get bad physiological responses when they have just a small amount of alcohol. What's going on there? Have you ever heard of this happening or seen this happen, where people will consume alcohol and their face will get really red? Turns out that about 40% of East Asians, so Japanese, Chinese, Korean, show this characteristic physiological response to drinking that includes facial flushing. So we call this fast flushing. There's a lot of variance among different Asian populations. It's been studied in Taiwanese, Filipino, Mongolian, Thai, and so on. Among non-Asians, fewer than 5% show this response. Here's a picture from one of these studies where they show just after the consumption of a small amount of alcohol, you see the face gets a little bit more red. I did this as well. One of my friends who has this response volunteered to show me. She had a couple of drinks. Here's Lisa before, here's Lisa afterwards, and her face just gets red. Well, what's going on? Look back to our metabolic pathway, ethanol being metabolized into acetaldehyde, being metabolized into acetate, and then being excreted from your body. People who have the fast flushing response don't produce a functioning version of aldehyde dehydrogenase. So what's going to happen if you don't produce aldehyde dehydrogenase? Well, think about it. You've blocked that conversion from acetaldehyde to acetate. So you consume the ethanol, gets converted into acetaldehyde, then it's blocked. Here's what an enzyme would look like. It's a big molecule, has an active site. That's where the molecule that's going to catalyze a reaction on, that's where it binds, and then the reaction happens, then the enzyme lets it go. Well, in cases of fast flushing, people have a slightly modified enzyme so that the acetaldehyde can't bind properly, and so the reaction can't be catalyzed. So you don't get any production of acetate, you get a buildup of acetaldehyde, and what's going to happen now? Well, here's a graph showing someone who is a fast flusher. This is the amount of acetaldehyde in their blood, and you can see in 20 minutes, it skyrockets. We've got a curve here in purple showing one version codes for aldehyde dehydrogenase that functions, but the other version they carry doesn't. So they have about half as much. And sure enough, their level of acetaldehyde goes up about half as high and then comes down. So we call that slow flushing. And then the flat curve at the bottom is someone who has two versions that are functioning of the aldehyde dehydrogenase. So what happens when you get all this extra acetaldehyde in your body? Well, it's kind of toxic. Causes first your skin to flush, then it causes sweating, then it causes your pulse to go up, causes nausea, causes vomiting, all sorts of bad effects as your body has to rely on other pathways to break it down. In the original research, they would put these pictures of the chromosomes showing, okay, you've got maybe one functional aldehyde dehydrogenase and you have one that doesn't. And in the original research, they would call it the defective aldehyde dehydrogenase gene because it coded for a non-functioning version. And it was talked about just as, oh, the mutant version doesn't work. But this might not actually be a good description of that other version of aldehyde dehydrogenase. Why do I say that? Well, in some research on alcohol use and abuse, what they found was this. Data from over 4,500 alcohol-dependent and control subjects, so these were alcoholics, found that possession of one non-functional aldehyde dehydrogenase enzyme was associated with a 5-fold reduction in alcoholism. In other words, if you can't process it and acetaldehyde builds up, then you're less likely to drink a lot. You're less likely to become an alcoholic. People who have two of the enzymes that don't function, it's associated with a 9-fold reduction. So they're like 1/10 as likely to become alcoholics because of this non-functioning aldehyde dehydrogenase. In another study of 1,300 alcoholics from Japan, how many of those do you think were fast flushers? Well, think about it. Okay, you don't have a functioning version of aldehyde dehydrogenase, so you consume ethanol, gets converted to acetaldehyde, builds up, now you feel nauseous, your pulse goes up, you start sweating. It's not reinforcing. So of those 1,300 Japanese alcoholics, how many were fast flushers? 0. Even though about half of all Japanese have an inactive form of aldehyde dehydrogenase. If you carry this allele, you're significantly less likely to become an alcoholic. Now, there are some other ways that chemicals can influence alcohol metabolism. Think about this. Let's say you were trying to make a drug because you wanted to help people be less likely to be alcoholics, or you wanted to help treat alcoholism. What would you do? What might you do? Well, there is a drug, antabuse. And what do you think antabuse does? Antabuse blocks the action of aldehyde dehydrogenase. Why is that useful? Well, if you block the action of aldehyde dehydrogenase, essentially you're making someone into a fast flusher. And we know that if you're a fast flusher, it's not reinforcing to drink, and your likelihood to be an alcoholic is reduced. Seems great, right? Except that antabuse doesn't really have a high success rate at treating alcoholism. Why do you think that is? Well, think about it. If someone is an alcoholic and they have this reinforcing situation when they consume ethanol, now you take a pill that makes you sick when you consume alcohol, they don't take it. So how could you improve this? A lot of the research is trying to figure out how can you give more of a time release version of it so you don't have to take the pill every single day. And if you could do that, you could be more effective at it. Now let me tell you about a different chemical effect on alcohol, aspirin. Aspirin blocks alcohol dehydrogenase. We've been talking about aldehyde dehydrogenase. Aspirin blocks the enzyme in the first step of the reaction. So what do you think that's going to do? Well, if we go back and we look at our pathway, ethanol getting metabolized into acetaldehyde, getting metabolized into acetate. Well, if you block the first enzyme, then no alcohol dehydrogenase or less, the ethanol sits there, doesn't become acetaldehyde, but ethanol does all those things I just talked about in your brain. So what happens? If you consume aspirin, you end up having a magnification of the effects of the alcohol. This is something that can be dangerous. People don't know this, and they will take some aspirin for some other reason, and then they consume alcohol, and it has a significantly greater effect because more of the ethanol ends up getting to your brain rather than getting broken down. So there you have it, 7 things about alcohol as it gets into our nervous system and kind of wreaks havoc. Most of it bad, but some of it not so bad.